Energy Code Update Stakeholder Input Meeting. If you're on the phone, this is Tim Gitterman with Navigant. I'll be doing some introductions shortly, but we're broadcasting live from Windsor. This is part of a two-part meeting here. We had one in Burlington on Thursday, and now we're in Windsor. So if you're on the phone, we're doing an in-person meeting. You can chat through the go-to meeting function to Barry if there's a problem or if you can't hear anything. Otherwise, I'll be just speaking to folks here, and then if you want to chime in, are they muted, Barry, or not muted?
Right now, it's muted because
he is. Oh, there's only one. Okay, so for the one attendee on the phone, if you want to chime in, just chat to Barry and let your voice be heard. Otherwise, we'll be having a meeting here. So, welcome everyone. Again, my name's Tim, and thanks for coming. And get this thing going. So the reason we're here today, and I'll get to some introductions, et cetera, but the basic reason is to get stakeholder input on this draft commercial building energy standard. One big suggestion, although we do have a small group, so we could probably get into some level of detail, but there are opportunities for public comment online through the Public Service Department website, through direct communication with Barry at Public Service Department or myself for very minor details, like if we want to work out wordsmithing and stuff. But for this meeting, we definitely want to hit the major changes and all that stuff, and hopefully we'll just try to referee any really rabbit hole discussions on something that we could take care of after. General comment. So we'll do some introductions, and then this is the agenda for today. We've got go over the code structure. It's just good to know sort of what's entailed and what's changed in terms of the overall chapter and section structure. And then we're really just going to go sequentially through the document itself using PowerPoint, but we can flip to the document as well when we want to drill down. And we'll just work through bigger stuff like scope and application and if existing building, how this applies to existing buildings. And then we'll work through envelope, mechanical, hopefully take a break if we time it right. Then there's water heating, lighting, and then there's a couple new sections for Vermont to consider, which are additional efficiency options or additional efficiency packages, and then a commissioning section. And then we'll hopefully wrap up and be done by 4. So just the team that's working on this is run out of Public Service Department, so that's Barry Murphy's in the room in the back there. And Kelly Launders also works with Barry at the service at PSC. And then we've got myself, Tim Gitterman, and Stu Sloat is in the back here with Navigant. And our office is in Burlington. And I'm working mainly on the commercial part of this. And we just wrapped up this morning's session, which was Richard Fazy and Jim Gravois of Energy Futures Group, and they're sort of spearheading the residential updates. And then we've also got a great group of advisors that Mike DeWine works for. I always forget what it stands for. Institute of Building
NBIS.
Okay, Building Technology and Safety. And he knows a lot about codes and what's happening, and he's out of Albany. And then we've got sort of a national perspective with Eric Makela at Brick McKellar Group and Jim Edelson with New Buildings Institute, and they're actually the Northwest. Excuse me. So how about who is here? Let's just go around the room and introduce yourself and why, what brings you here, what's your interest in the code update?
I'm Stephanie Miller-Riskin with REM Development. We're a commercial developer and landlord. I'd say primarily our interest is how the code update affects retrofitting older buildings, particularly buildings that are 30 years old. From a construction standpoint, they're fairly efficient. And we're concerned with remaining competitive when you're less on the new build. Those are much easier, but really how this affects the retrofitting and how expensive it's going to be every time you change the interior side.
Okay, that's great.
Bill Badger, I'm the end user.
Yes.
And I do mostly residential, but not commercial.
Okay. My name is Andrew Windsor. I'm the local affordable housing developer.
I'm Kevin Rose from Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnerships, or NEEP. We are a regional energy efficiency nonprofit serving 12-state area from Maine down to D.C. over to Pennsylvania. Amongst a bunch of other things, we work on with those states on their code adoption and compliance.
Great. And if the person or people on the phone have a vested interest they want the group to know about, just let Barry know. I think you're on mute. All right. So that was what we just did there. And all right. So big picture background. And this update is required by law in Vermont state statute every 3 years. The last code, the current code that is in place is considered the 2011 CVs. Should be copies back there if you want to look at one. And so here we are 3 years again and going for the next required update. So the sort of newest thing that's happened since the last update is Act 89, which passed in the Vermont State Legislature last year, I believe, 2012 or 2013, probably 2013. And it had some things, a lot of them not specific to commercial, but overall a few main things. One, they did require that town administrators provide information about the energy code, I believe, when people come in for permits. So in towns where there is permitting processes happening, they need to provide some information about energy codes that are relevant and just to try to get better education out there. And then also are now tying a certificate of occupancy or the COO tied to producing the certificate of compliance that's required. And then Act 89 also mandates a stretch code for the residential, for RBs, the Residential Building Energy Standards. So that stretch code is above the base code. And the language in the statute reads such that that will be optional for adoption by local jurisdictions, but for Act 250 projects that have to go through Act 250, that's going to be the requirement, is they meet the stretch code. So that's something to consider. So there is no requirement for commercial stretch code, but we will talk at the end. We are going to create a commercial stretch code. It does not go through the formal rulemaking process of everything else, but it will be out there. And right now, it would follow. It would also be optional. Local jurisdictions could adopt that. The second thing that it could do is Act 250 on the commercial side. They have language that says use the best available technology. That's the language. And so the hope on the side of the department is that maybe this could give something for them to point to, rather than this gray area of the best available technology. To say, listen, there is a commercial stretch code. So that's the goal there. All right, so this is the schedule. We're there up at the top. The first big comment period on this wraps up only in a few weeks on July 9th, but that is to try to we're trying to get to the 95+% of this draft, the big issues out of the way from the stakeholders, worked out and commented on, because all of this backs out of an effective date of March 2015 through the state process of this LCAR hearing, ICAR, LCAR. This process has to happen on a certain timeline. And the reason, it's probably more important on the residential side, but the reason to push for the March effective date is to get into that building season that starts next year, so there's not sort of two codes at the start of a new building season. But to be clear, comments can still happen essentially through September. It's in our best interest to get big stuff out of the way and hopefully worked out because we have the most opportunity to present that back to stakeholders if we get these comments in. And just start interrupting with questions. Don't hold back conversational here. We do have a great format on the Public Service Department's website to provide comments. And obviously, it takes 2 seconds to fill this in online. If you would prefer to write it all in an email, we can help get that back into this format if that's necessary. But the more that come in this way, we'll have a formal log, and then we'll be able to update the website with here's what's been commented on, here's the responses. And we did print out some in the back of these on paper, so if while during the day today you want to write them down, then we can take those with us, and we'll just log them in there on your behalf. So that's kind of the background. Now I just want to get into the code itself and start talking details. So we've got the foundational document we're working off for this, what we're calling the 2015 CBs, is going to be the 2015 International Energy Conservation Code. So the current prevailing code, 2011 CBs, was the base document was the 09, but really when that update, the timing of that update just so happened that 2012 IECC and the ASHRAE 90.1 2010 were really just about to be published. So we had them in draft version and everything. They weren't final during that process. So really the 2011 CBs was mostly based on the 2012. So it's not really like we're jumping 2 cycles here completely. But but this one is based on 2015. And really the validation for that is a few things. One, 2012 was a major switch in the national model codes and international energy conservation codes. So 2012 took a lot of language that had happened from guidelines such as core performance that was out there that Efficiency Vermont's been using for years, and then they codified that language into Massachusetts Stretch Code, and then groups like the Department of Energy and New Buildings Institute and others and American Institute of Architects got together and proposed all of these new changes to the 2012 IECC. And so it was a big shift for the code. And whenever that happens, some of the stuff doesn't work out so well. 2015 is improved, clarified. Things are changed too, but it's really like a better document. And it's kind of like using the latest Windows version or the latest version of a Windows software. You want to take the latest and greatest and start with that rather than have to work your way backwards. There you go. Yeah. Well, we're kind of open software, our open platform. We get to Vermontize it, so that is a nice thing. And if there's some change in 2015 that stakeholders don't approve of or don't want to see, you can scale that back or change it in any direction you want. So that's up to the public to do that. All right. So we look at this document as a whole. We've got scope and administration, and then you get definitions, and then you have these general requirements, which are sort of compliance-oriented, but there's some general stuff in there. And then you get into the nitty-gritty details of commercial efficiency, and that's, well, we'll go through all those sections, but the new sections highlighted here is system commissioning and this additional efficiency package options, neither of which exist in our 2011 CBs. And then what they did was, and I've heard this, vested interest in existing buildings. So this is going to be for you to read through this, get as much as you can out today, but certainly dig through over the next couple of weeks, and let's hash out if it's working for what Vermont stakeholders need, because it used to be like 3 paragraphs at the beginning of the code. You might have seen it, but in the Chapter 1, it said, existing buildings, additions, alterations, historic buildings, and that was it. And it felt kind of confusing. And so they've taken it into a whole new chapter, and they've elaborated each one of those out to hopefully be more specific and more clear. But we did have some comments during the residential section or residential workshop that some people thought it really wasn't that much more clear. And so we need help. If we can make it more clear or work better for constituents, I think we need to. But anyways, it is its own new chapter. It does have some different stringency standards for historic buildings, for lighting systems, for example, and alterations. We'll go through those. But that's one of the big changes that people are, code advocates at least, are excited about. And then there's reference standards at the end of the document. Okay, so today, we're going to work through slides. We can go through the major changes. We could go through the code language when needed. We could talk details. We want to have Q&A discussion throughout. We got to referee tangential discussions where we have to, but let's make this conversational and make it work for you, because that's why we're here. So getting into this, we've got, we'll talk right now, like I said, the first chapter, and then I'll jump right to this Chapter 5, existing buildings, instead of waiting to the end, because it's sort of a bigger scope question than it's how the code applies to buildings more than it is specific requirements. So when we look at the scope section, some of the changes now, and I know, is that you said you work with the multifamily buildings more? Okay. So there is some clarification in the draft code that is basically just to make it that much more clear and align with what's in other places of state statute that talk about mixed occupancy buildings. So the code historically has for a while splits between 3 stories or less is residential and follows residential code. 3 stories or more is commercial, and then you follow the commercial code. Now, certain places, mostly in envelope, there's some Group R requirements. So the envelope requirements might differ slightly for a Group R requirement of say, a wall or roof type. And then I think a few different places, maybe in electrical and lighting, is where some of the residential requirements are a little different. But what we've done here now is really just broaden the language to make it very consistent with state statute, and that language is basically directly from state statute that tries to clarify so there's not so much of a gray area between residential and commercial buildings. There's always been these exempt buildings or building types or applications in the code. Greenhouses are now exempt. That was an add to the 2015 IECC. So that's in there unless we hear otherwise. There's been a comment already. We have inflatable buildings are sort of just whole heart exempt, and we had a comment that we should add some language to make that a inflatable buildings that are of a temporary nature may be exempt. But if you're going to build a permanent building that's just somehow inflatable, maybe we can find some better language that doesn't just blanket exempt it from the code or from the envelope provisions of the code, which is all it says. It's just exempted from the envelope building. So that's that's in there as a comment right now. There's a minor thing where the National Model Code, for whatever reason, requires building projects to submit 2 sets of drawings to the code official or authority having jurisdiction. We don't have a great deal of code authorities, or code officials or authorities having jurisdiction in Vermont. So, but you do have to submit a set of drawings to, I think, is it only Act 250? Or do you get drawings for projects? This was a public comment to make this just one. That's all I know. Okay, so that was, I think that was the public comment was that, if we're going to submit drawings for fire safety, let's make it only one rather than 2. Something you wouldn't necessarily see in the code itself, and I should mention this if you're looking at the draft code that's published, or if you have it in front of you on paper, which is back there. Everything that's struck out. We use the term red line, but the red lines aren't really red, and that's just Microsoft's kind of thing. That's not really us. But if it's struck out or if it's underlined, meaning the underline means added in, struck out means it's struck out. That's against the 2015 code. So, but some things get in here that are yellow highlighted. That means it's new to the 2015 IECC, and it wasn't in our 2011 CB, so it's just new. And other than highlighting it, we would have no way to show you that it's new to Vermont. If that makes sense. So yellow highlighted is just sort of new to the code, but we didn't necessarily add it in. If it's added in as an underline, that means we added in, and typically those are from public comments or they're from things we've carried through in Vermont for years and are state specific, and we're carrying them through again. But this last thing on this slide is the process applications. That was in 2011 CBs. We had some language carried over from ASHRAE, and there's been a public comment. We struck it out because it caused a lot of confusion where people thought that industrial buildings entirely were exempt, and it really just exempts industrial process systems and applications. But the public comment is to bring it back in and just clarify it so it doesn't create so much confusion. I don't know how much that concerns people in this room right now, so keep moving. But moving on to existing buildings. You can read the quote on the slide, but the folks at New Buildings Institute think this is like a major significant change in finally getting this code to apply and create some energy efficiency gains in existing buildings that undergo, not existing buildings that are just existing, but existing buildings that are undergoing major alterations and additions and repairs that qualify under what the code defines them as. So they see this as a big shift.
Major.
Well, let's get into it, and we might have to open up the code itself to get into the definition. But I kind of mentioned this already, but it was just a few small sections. It now goes through general, which talks about historic and other things, and then it gets at additions, alterations, repairs, and change in occupancy, which could be considered sort of the 4 situations for triggering the code. You're going to build an addition, you're altering, which would be renovation would be another word, and then repairs, and then change in occupancy. So one thing to note when you look at the existing building section, though, is that just to make it clear, it's not requiring anything of existing buildings. You don't need to, remove the building, not use it anymore, or not maintain it if it's just in existence at the time of the code. It only applies if you have an addition, alteration, or repair. So now if you're looking at, Chapter 5, so let's find that so we can talk. Yeah.
A lot of yellow.
Yeah, because it's all new, yeah. So it's all new to us, right? It's all new to Vermont. That's a good point. And that's on, does this have a page number? It's tricky.
You might call it C95.
5, yeah. It's sort of skipped.
Which is right after C.
93. Yeah, we've deleted some blank pages. So when you tweak this code like this, it doesn't format very well. So it wasn't originally written in Word, let's just say that. So okay, so we're on there. So when you get into the general section, there is now a subsection on historic buildings, and that used to be a blanket exemption in the IECC. So literally, it was just all historic buildings were exempt. So that was sort of an automatic opt-out, and that's section 501.6, which actually on my slide I have is 501.5, so I'll make that note. So 501.6 historic buildings, now it's essentially an automatic opt-in unless, and it says unless there's a report that's been provided, signed by a registered design professional, an owner. This is interesting. I'm sorry, I'm going to stop here. Barry and Stu, though, do you remember we were reading the language on the residential side? Didn't it say an owner?
It did.
So why is it any different here? You mean the original IECC?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. This is interesting. We're carrying through our residential conversation today, and it's different. It's slightly different language, so we need to look at that. But I'll report back to you. Somehow there is a report that is by a registered design professional or representative of the State Historic Preservation Office, and possibly by an owner, but we're going to look into that for you right now. And that now says, I, as the person signing this, think that complying with a certain provision of this code would threaten, degrade, or destroy my form, fabric, or function of the building. So it's really just opting yourself out of a provision. So it'd have to say, I cannot comply with the envelope provisions of the code because it's going, detrimental, or maybe it's the lighting, or maybe it's mechanical. Maybe it's the whole thing, but that would probably, it's more on, the burden is more on the, these parties to justify that the code is actually a negative to the building and cannot comply.
It looks like the actual language does say owner, representative.
Okay, so owner is in there. That's so weird because no one ever touched this language at all. Okay.
Actually, that's under R.
Ah. So is there a C? Yeah. Oh, you know what? I think that's intentional, Stu.
You're right. I'm only looking at residential.
So just to back up a second here, if you take the IECC as it comes from the ICC, you have residential chapters and commercial chapters started with an R or a C. And so the Chapter 5 existing buildings exist for both residential and commercial. And clearly there was an intent where they list owner for homes, for residential. They do not list that as someone who could sign this report on the commercial side. That's the difference. Yeah. All right. That's odd. It's not odd. It doesn't surprise me, but that would be certainly up for debate among stakeholders. But I just want to point that out, that if you own a home, you could sign this report. If you own a building, you need to get a registered design professional or a representative of the State Historic Office to sign on your behalf.
More than likely, if you're doing work on commercial buildings,
I think that would be the.
you probably already have some.
Yeah. You don't necessarily have to have an architect. Yeah, exactly. It's maybe an onerous burden on you. So. Okay, so that's a big change. It's an opt-in, really. Now when we get to and you'll have to read it, and I'm sorry, I forgot. Stephanie. So Stephanie, you might want to read where under the section additions or the section alterations, it really should, hopefully for us, define what an alteration is and what kind of alteration exempts, or what kind, additions are a little more obvious, I think. Alterations probably a little more of a gray area, and you probably want to really familiarize yourself with what's accepted from it, because certain stuff that you might do is accepted from it, and then we probably want to discuss or report back on whether that whether you think that's fair, it works, and if that's how Vermont's going to roll with this. But each section is now expanded and separately handled. And then the slide I have here talks about the alterations section, which is section 503, and it talks about the lighting systems part. And what this does, this change from the existing code, is now it says that if you do an alteration and you replace less than 10% of the luminaires in the space, you're exempt. But essentially, if you're replacing more than 10% of your fixtures in a commercial space under a qualifying alteration, that space that you touch needs to come into compliance with the lighting section of the code and in its entirety. So it needs to meet the lighting power densities, the watts per square foot, needs to meet the lighting controls requirements, and so on. And that's a pretty big change, and I think when that quote I had before was really getting at that, a lot of these big lighting retrofits would still do maybe less than 50% in a given space or something, and so this is just getting at more electrical lighting use in existing buildings, and that will get at some energy savings.
And one thing Steve mentioned this morning is that in this section 501.4 compliance lists many other side codes. We need to talk to them about.
Because is that really Vermont appropriate, right? Okay, 501.4 says compliance, and it lists literally all of these, plumbing, fire, and I don't know if necessarily all of those are even in effect in Vermont. So we're kind of the wild east, right? So, okay, so that's good. And the other, the issue I have that I'm going to follow up with is this fact that luminaires in a space. I mean, to me, I can say that's kind of obvious what space means, but I don't think that's necessarily well-defined or that clear. So I think just make it I'm almost as a public stakeholder going to make that comment that I think space should be better defined, especially when it gets there, because that's just opening up a can of worms for a gray area that doesn't necessarily need to be. I mean, I think it makes sense, but it's probably on a case-by-case basis it could get pretty confusing. And I will point out, without going into great detail, our investigative digging, because we're kind of the 2015 was just published last month, and we're really the first state to sort of rip into it and really dig at it and use it for ourselves. This happens in several other states, but we're the first go-around. We did find a conflict that we will strike, and it's not in this draft because we found it after this, but if you look at the exception 7 to section C503, that was in the old code. That said alterations that replace less than 50% of the luminaires in a space are exempt. And then they added this specific requirement for lighting systems that exempted alterations that replace less than 10%. The two can't coexist, and we will just delete the 50% one because it was not supposed to be there. It was a mistake. So we pointed that out to the ICC, and they were, whoops. So, all right. And, again, I'm happy to talk offline after this breaks any more on these items for further detail and clarification. It's a lot to wrap your mind around sometimes, so certainly that's what we're here for. But I will just keep moving in the interest of time. We're going to go in the building envelope section. So now we're into the commercial energy efficiency chapter, section 402, building envelope. I want to point out that there's a section called the thermal resistance of cold-formed steel walls. I'm getting some feedback from Pacific Northwest National Labs. They're essentially a subcontractor to DOE. We have a resident code expert in Vermont who deals with who works for PNNL and happens to live in Vermont. He provides a lot of input, and essentially this section in the code was just thrown in there on this 2015 IECC, and it was from some sort of steel industry, and it doesn't seem to really jive with the other part of the envelope table, and it doesn't jive with ASHRAE necessarily, and I pointed that out to him, and I'm essentially at this point proposing that we just cut it out. It wasn't in our 2011 CVs. I don't think it's helping anything. but unless anyone has any more input on that, it might just go away. It's really not doing a lot for us. Okay, so when we go to the opaque envelope, which is of interest to a lot of folks, I'll flip over to the code itself here, and we can look at envelope values. But if you have the paper copy in front of you, what you're looking at is our table. We kind of strike out all the climate zones in the IECC, and we put in our own Vermont-specific table that just gets at what we require. And for the purpose of this draft code, and I apologize if it's at all confusing, but anything in parentheses and red font is actually the old code, so that's actually what's in 2011. And anything that's just in regular font is really what's in the proposed to be in the draft code. And so some discussion points as we walk through these values is, and some of these are based on already public comments that have come in or came up last week also in Burlington. Should there be higher R values for insulation above deck? We have a comment to add some metal building descriptions so people know what we're talking about when we use terms like LS, which is liner system. There's been some changes to the wall continuous insulation values to align them between all the different wall types, and I can show you that in the code. And then some discussion points, again, public comments that have come in saying should we put higher R values for certain doors. So if I can find the track. People in the room have any points of contention or questions on the code? I mean, I don't necessarily need to dig through it if people aren't interested or don't have any more questions, but I do the due diligence and show you what we're referring to here. So we've got, again, insulation entirely above deck on roofs. We're at R30. This is really no change from CB's 2011, and some people are just saying we should go higher. 2 higher climate zones, R7 and R8. We're climate zone 6. Those are at R35 continuous. So there's been some comment there to just go higher for that, both that and metal buildings. The R value for attic has gone up, R49. Now, what's an attic insulation on the residential side right now? Where are they at?
49.
It's 49?
Yeah.
So that's good, because there was a comment earlier today about these things should be consistent. So I think that's at least getting at that consistency between RVs and CVs. There's no change to mass walls so far, all this proposed. But what I did mention, and again, this I don't think, this is not even in the draft code that's in front of you, because this public comment came in, which I think makes a lot of sense. I'm trying to incorporate this, is that the continuous, the national model code only gives us these kind of like double layer systems, like R13 plus R13 continuous, or R13 plus R7 continuous. They don't give single value cavity insulation or even single value continuous insulations. And we do in Vermont. We offer that as a prescriptive option. And those really, from a thermal building science perspective, should all be the same. So they really should be 19.5 across the board here for continuous, because it's just keeping the heat transfer between the outside and the inside the same across all wall types. So that was so far been incorporated. And again, it all depends on the users and your interest. It depends how passionate or something. If you have a bone to pick on one of these, or you want to see something dialed back or forward, otherwise there might not be a lot of conversation here. But I'm just putting these up here in front of you. I do know. Did we just have a discussion during the break about the foundation walls, right? And that would be on the, I believe, on the. Is that on the heated slab or the unheated slab? I mean, where would that fit in? I maybe I have to zoom in somewhere. But we require, and again, I think for those dealing with the residential occupancies or multifamily buildings, wherever it's split out into 2 values, the one on the right is the group R. So that would be the portion of the building that encloses a group of a residential occupancy would have to meet that standard. And so if you have an unheated slab, it's R15 for a group R versus R10 on just a commercial building.
And the same up above that, where you've got walls. Walls below grade.
Walls below grade. Okay, that's it. That's the R10. And I think the public comment, which I think Stu will note, is this has come up twice now since last week, is that this should be consistent with the residential, which is R15. Right? I mean,
At this point, sounds like
at this point,
maybe an option dial.
oh, they might dial back. Well, see, that's the difference. The residential has these packages, or, you know, that's my understanding. So, anyhow, take this stuff in. If you have others who want to give comments or yourself, it's not, the pressure's not on to comment now or, you know, forever hold your peace. It's just I'm putting this all out there. So that's what's in there, and there's some comments that some of these doors can handle some higher R values as industry standard, and they might as well just go up now. I'll just keep moving through though. So we go from building envelope. You get to you start with the opaque stuff we just talked about, the walls and roofs and slabs, and then you get to fenestration, so windows, really anything that's not opaque. And this has continually been, the codes have gone from 50% in the 2005 CB's maximum fenestration area, so 50% of your gross wall area can be windows, down to 40% in our current 2011. And the proposed here coming from the 2015 ICC is 30%. But on the next slide we'll talk about there are options in the prescriptive code to go above that. So this is what this refers to that. So if you want to increase your vertical fenestration, so in layman's terms, if you want more windows, you can go up to 40%, which again gets you back to where we were in the code before, but you have to follow a few key criteria that ensures you're harvesting your daylight. So it's basically saying, sure, add more windows because that it might be desirable from a number of standpoints, architecturally, comfort, visually, et cetera, but you need to scale back the electrical lighting use through daylight responsive controls. The same thing with skylights. Skylights are capped at a 3% area, and they allow you to go up to 5% with similar criteria as listed up top here. I just didn't list them all there, but you have to have daylight responsive controls, and you can increase your skylight area up to stated maximum. Now a new portion of the building envelope that's new to the 2015 ICC and completely new to the our Vermont code is that if you have greater than 2,500 square feet and you're working with a high bay area, so again, we're probably talking warehouses, industrial applications for the most part, but you never know with the high bay ceilings. You just have to have, and it's hard to read all these requirements, but you really just have to make sure you have enough of a daylight zone, and then in those daylight zones, you have to meet the daylight responsive controls requirements. So it's really just saying, if you got a big area and you got big ceilings, you're going to have to sort of daylight it. You're going to have daylight, harvest daylight. And I think what's new about that is that now the code's starting to interact with itself. It's basically in the envelope requirements is triggering lighting requirements, right? And that's, you know, if you're a code geek, then that's new. I think that's a new shift in sort of the, you know, getting at all this stuff. So that's it on envelope that I have as major changes. They're really the biggest change to the envelope came in our last update, where there's just air. You know, it's really a push for more continuous air barriers, and there's a few options for meeting that. And one of the options is still a building leakage test, so a blower door test, and you can get below a certain CFM per square foot of building shell area. That hasn't changed. It's still in there. So if you'd want to see that change or anything, or people want to push for requiring these kinds of tests, then that can certainly be a topic of discussion. Otherwise, we get into mechanical systems. Now, this is a good example of of why you would want to use the latest and greatest code for sure, because the 2012 IECC, one of the biggest changes in the IECC is they've continually tried, as you know or don't know, I haven't done a great job explaining it so far, but you can comply with our code. If you comply with the CBs, you can do that, or an alternative compliance path is to follow ASHRAE 90.1 standard. And in this case, for our new proposed code, it will be the 2013 standard. For 2011, it was the 2007 ASHRAE 90.1. But the two code, the IECC has been trying to sort of bring in as much of 90.1 as possible throughout each update cycle. It's been bringing in more and more of ASHRAE. It used to be a very simplified, kind of dumbed down code. it's now gotten more complex with each update, and it's brought in more from ASHRAE. And as they've done that, they haven't done the best job all the time. So in the 2012 IECC, the mechanical section, they brought in a lot of changes from ASHRAE, but they screwed some stuff up. So without getting into great deal of detail, some of the economizer requirements were actually screwed up in the 2012 IECC, where certain stuff is essentially by default exempted because they enumerated the sections wrong. I mean, really just stuff, human stuff that happens when you try to change stuff. So 2015, I think, does a much better job of getting away from what they had before, which was this. They broke everything into simple systems and complex systems, and then they tried to apply economizer requirements to both of those. Instead, now they just give you some general stuff, and then they say, hey, every HVAC system type has to follow all of these things, and that lists most of the sections with, and I highlight some of the things that are new. And then they say, okay, economizers are important. Here they are across all system types. Here's the requirements. And then there's some more prescriptive, detailed requirements for certain complicated systems, like hydronic and multiple zone systems. And something totally new to the code is some performance requirements on refrigeration systems. So that's new. Okay, so I have this kind of framed as discussion points. So I'll try to bring these out. If you have other comments or things you want to see or need to know about, then we can talk about that. Electric resistance prohibition. So electric resistant heat has been prohibited in Vermont since the earliest codes. Still in there, but a discussion point I want to bring up with stakeholders is there's a supplemental heat pump section, and we have always just said, like supplemental heat pump supplemental heat for heat pumps using electric resistant heat is prohibited in Vermont. Things are changing. Cold climate heat pumps are coming along. People are doing low energy buildings using heat pumps and then using renewable energy. And at a certain point, I imagine this is going to go away or go away with certain caveats. And so it's just out there for discussion. I think, Stu, correct me if I'm wrong, when it came out of the Burlington meeting, I think people thought it should still be in there, at least that group. But put that out there. So something to just consider. As technology changes, some of these prohibitions don't make sense. Snow and ice melt system. There is a requirement in there right now, and that's 4.3.2.4.5, that if you have one, again, the code doesn't tell you have to melt snow. That would be a bit silly, but it does say if you're going to do it, you need to use some heat recovery or from other systems on site, or use some on-site renewables. So if you deal with projects that have that could hit your, that could hit home for you. You might want to consider how applicable that is and comment accordingly. Go ahead.
Same question, residential.
Up in the air for the renewables or for the snow melt?
Snow melt.
You mean up in the air like on the roof? So I believe it's just anything that's tied into the building electrical system. So it's both. So it'd be like, driveways and stuff, unless those are separate. I think if you had a driveway, I hate to go on a limb, but I'm pretty sure if you had a big parking area or something and you snow melted it and it was totally metered separately than the building, I don't think it comes under the provisions of this code. Is that correct, Barry? Do you interpret that?
The residential question,
Well, yeah.
and it's less so except that commercial buildings can be zigzag stuff on the roof.
Like heat tape and all that. Yeah.
So again, it's just like in a residential, it's pavement. Talk about pavement.
Yeah, then that's a different application. Here it says snow and ice melt.
It says, well, here you go. So here's the specific language. It says hydronic systems need at least 25% of the design annual energy consumption still be provided by on-site renewables or heat recovery. Electric systems have to have at least 50% of their design demand, peak load demand. So they provided by those two options. So they get a hydronic and electric. But I think it's still the interpretation of whether or not you're completely separate from your building or not is probably.
Increasingly, our not in Burlington. More and more eco districts and things like that are looking at doing efficiency on the scale. So any forward thinking that can be done, whether that's on site or on whatever that right word is. I'm not sure.
No, but so that's where, you know, maybe you had again, I think where we see a lot of this in Vermont might be resorts, you know, up in the mountains really, where they're just catering to people coming and going and they want it free and easy and convenient to get in and out. And so you could get opportunities because you almost have a campus-like situation where you have heat recovery from something else. But, I mean, they do allow for heat recovery or on-site renewables. And again, we don't have to accept this in Vermont if we don't want to. So I'll keep moving. Economizer fault detection and diagnostics. If you're familiar at all with mechanical systems and economizing, which is free cooling and taking advantage of free cooling, it's a great idea. It saves a lot of energy. They're often not working right, and the code has been trending towards trying to not only get at the way something is built, but the way it's going to operate. And so the IECC now has a fault detection and diagnostic section for economizers, which essentially, and I don't know if I have, I don't really have more details on here, but it really just requires certain sensors to be enabled and certain system reports to be able to be pulled, and for, you know, third parties to easily verify whether the economizers are working or not. Because oftentimes it's just diagnosing whether it's working or not isn't that straightforward without paying someone to check everything out. And this has been in Title 24 now for a couple of years, so it's taken over in California, which means the manufacturers have to respond. The manufacturers will respond with equipment that's enabled like this. We don't necessarily have an assembly line just for Vermont HVAC equipment, so I don't know if, you know, just because they're pushing to the West Coast with this, if it's gotten here yet. And so I think we put it out there for folks, and we talked about it last week with people, and there were a lot of mechanical engineers in the room, is what is this going to cost if it's not spec'd out, you know, in default in the HVAC equipment? So if that adds a cost that's unburdened, you know, or too onerous to our, you know, small rural state, it might not be desirable. And I think there was one commenter saying, I think that, you know, his belief was that the cost that's going to incur, and he was going to go check with his vendors at Train and whatnot, and he thought the cost that it would incur would outweigh the benefits. So there are some mixed opinions, and I don't think it's been settled yet. Okay, do either of you work with parking garages? I imagine you do. You don't with the multifamily buildings? Okay, I guess we're in Vermont. We don't really necessarily pack in the parking garages down here. Yeah, right. Put it on the field. So there are some just requirements for essentially, you know, modulating and variable speed control of fans, and actually operating those on sensing devices. So it's just like we have this thing called demand-controlled ventilation in conference rooms now, where you can sense there's too much CO2 coming from occupants. Same thing in parking garages. Let's have sensing devices that are going to operate fans rather than 8,760 hours a year. We're going to operate them at some lesser number and save energy, because you don't always need that. But there are exemptions if it's a smaller garage, has less exhaust fans, etc. Energy recovery has been in the code for a while, and it's steadily sort of increased stringency, and I think that's what you see again. So there's a lot of numbers on this slide. In general, what we have now in Vermont is if your system has 5,000 CFM supply error and it's taking in at least 70% outdoor air, then you're required to do energy recovery on that ventilation system. The new proposal would now expand that pretty far down. So if you have anywhere over 10% outdoor air and a big level of CFM, so that far left on the slide here, 26,000, you would need to have energy recovery. So essentially, hitting more systems. But there's also, it also differentiates between hours of operation. So this table here is for less than 8,000 hours of operation. If your ventilation system is going to operate more than 8,000 hours per year, which is essentially more than 90% a year, then it's required to have energy recovery, no matter what the design airflow rate is. So another comment on there's something new in the code that came through public comment. It is in the draft code here, and it proposes to require rooftop units to have wall insulation, which is, according to the public comment, is fairly available in industry and can be standard spec through vendors. That when you get your rooftop unit, it has a minimum of, I think they propose an R8 or something. I have to look at the language in that section. But that section, so that's in there. That's a Vermont-specific comment. And then the duct insulation has sort of steadily ramped up a little bit for ducts in unconditioned space and ducts in outdoor airspace. But the stakeholder input or issues that need to be resolved are why not make it consistent with RVs? So the residential requirement has essentially, through some clever language, said you either insulate your outside ducts to the nearest wall surface, which would in a house typically be your roof. So if your roof's R49, I'm going to say, but make the ducts R49. Well, it makes more sense just to bring the ducts inside, however possible, wherever possible. Bring them in. That's the goal. Bring them in, rather than just say that. They sort of give you an option. And that's not the case in commercial. And you could walk out across, actually, if you walk out this door, you look at the building right behind us, I noticed pretty well insulated exterior ducts up there. But I don't know what level of insulation that is without measuring it. But some people are just saying the amount of thermal load that is in those ducts and being wasted to unconditioned and outdoor spaces is absurd, and we should pick some sort of better R value. Maybe it's the equivalent of the wall, maybe it's the equivalent of the roof, maybe it's the same as the residential language. But there's been a number of comments that it's time for a change, and that should be more regulated. I don't have anything to offer on that, but it's out there. All this refrigeration equipment performance is very similar to the HVAC performance stuff. It's tables and tables of federal standards. So we don't get into a great lot of detail because this is federal standards that affect manufacturers. Now they publish in the code to essentially validate that there are minimum efficiency requirements across commercial refrigeration. We don't have much say over that. We can't require higher or lower than those. They're called federal minimums. In some senses, they're called federal maximums. Anyways, it's new to the code, and it's good to see that refrigeration is being brought in, so like grocery stores and convenience stores, where I think it does get into beyond just like manufacturer requirements, is the efficiency measures that I list here. So, and some of these are rebated by Efficiency Vermont right now. The motion sensors on display cases, which if you've been in a relatively updated grocery store refrigeration section, when you're the first one in there, you walk past the freezer case, the lights will come on now. That's kind of new stuff, but that's actually going to be required by code. Defrost controls for low temperature display cases, and anti-sweat heater controls that keeps the frost from getting on the glass. Well, the anti-sweat heaters keep the frost on the glass. The controls keep the anti-sweat heaters from running all the time. They only run based on sort of the humidity, the dew point of the store. So all these things are now going to be required by code, which means they're going to not be incentivized by groups like Efficiency Vermont, for good or for bad. I mean, it's basically progress towards efficiency. So again, knowing that this audience isn't necessarily deep in mechanical engineering, I don't want to misstate that, but it doesn't seem like that's our main interest. Heat pumps were, through some of this language in the code last time, were basically, I don't know, it was more challenging to implement a cost-effective heat pump system under our current version of the 2011 CBs just because of some language about economizers. And so we're working with some very simple fix to that excludes heat pumps from this sort of calculation you have to do if you have a lot of small systems. So if you have a lot of small systems that adds up to a certain number, we exclude heat pumps from that calculation, and that way we're not completely eliminating heat pumps as an option for your building cooling. If you want better, clearer information on that, I can elaborate. And then, again, on the refrigeration, there's even more on refrigeration where they get into details about condensers and compressors. And a lot of that's some pretty techy stuff. They get into the motors, variable speed motors, controlling multiple condenser fans in unison, and some pressure controls, et cetera. So some stuff that's normally been in the domain of good refrigeration system design or operation is now getting into the domain of energy codes. So new. What are we doing on time? I don't know if people want to want to go a little more and then take a little break, or if people want a few-minute break right now, just stretch your legs after lunch. No, we'll keep going. All right.
Not a long chapter.
Not a long chapter now. So, all right. So we've got. I think, from my understanding, the IECC is that this section is seen some new, it hasn't changed much in the last few cycles, and this is probably the most it's changed. And those changes are discussed here in these bullets. But the first one is that where we have a lot of water heating capacity. So whether it's one big system that's over 1 million BTU hours, or a combination of systems, with some exception because they're listed in the code, that add up to 1 million, then it just requires a minimum average thermal efficiency for those systems of 90%. And what that's getting at is, rather than going into the service water heating equipment sort of federal minimum standards, it just gets at an overall, for big buildings with a lot of service water heating demand, it's going to get at, like, let's get a 90% efficiency for all of this. Let's just deliver your water heating at 90% efficient. And then this is a pretty big change, though. There's still piping insulation requirements on service hot water. But I think the goal of advocates for efficiency in hot water design have introduced 2 new methods to get a more efficient design. And that's one, through controlling the length of the pipe that is serving your service hot water, and the other is to control the amount of water that can go in that pipe. And so there's 2 new tables, some new calculations, and that's what it's doing. It's basically just trying to reduce the amount of pipe run in your building. So it might force, in certain situations, another water heater, but obviously the math has to be done, and you have to either limit your pipe length or limit your pipe volume. So that's new. And then there are new requirements for start-stop pump controls for circulation of hot water, where you have a circulating system, typically found in a commercial application, and it's got to be responsive to the demand, rather than just constantly go. Heat trace systems, and you know, I mean, I interpret that as the those are the that's like heat tape as well. Is that correct? Something I probably need to look more into, but I take that as like the heat tape that's on service hot water piping to keep it at a certain temperature in the pipe. And you have to, you know, that also has to respond to demand and be controlled to adjust the energy input that's going into that system. And that reduces electric demand. There are some detailed requirements on hot water storage controls. I'm not going into any length on that here. The pumps need to be controlled on-off and limit the temperature of water that enters the cold water piping to a certain temperature on recirculation loops. At first read in the code, there's a drain water heat recovery section. It doesn't, when I first read it, I thought it actually required drain water heat recovery, which I thought would be a fairly big impact on people, and especially in residential applications, but it doesn't. It just says if you're using this, it needs to meet a certain minimum efficiency. So, and that refers over to an ANSI standard. So it says if you're going to go with drain water heat recovery, it's just not willy-nilly. Now the code is saying just do it to this standard that's already published somewhere else. But I have a note in there that we should, because what we try to do in Vermont whenever possible is expand and define these definitions so you're not left as a user trying to figure out what ANSI standard this is and that, and we're all Googling around for something. Let's just get it in the code if it's that important. So this is something that I guess, Barry, Sue, you can comment. I think I heard, I'd say the group was generally uncomfortable with this in Burlington. I think they wanted this to be reconsidered. We took a section, we proposed something in here that's really from the IGCC. So I don't know how familiar you are, but this is the IGCC we talk about a lot. The International Green Construction Code is sort of one level above that. That's almost like the code version of LEED, if you're familiar with LEED buildings. So it's more stringent, it's more comprehensive. It gets into green buildings and more sustainability and other stuff beyond energy. But anyhow, this section is in there for their energy section and was proposed for the 2015 IUCC. Did not pass by one vote or something, and so we thought, hey, we're in Vermont. We don't have a lot of outdoor heated pools and spas and hot tubs and commercial applications, but we do have a lot of resorts, and maybe we should give this a go. And what this is saying is you would have to get at least 70% of your energy for heating one of these outdoor applications from site recovering energy, which would be like heat recovery, or maybe it says such as a heat pump. If a heat pump was rejecting heat from somewhere else, you could use it there, or a renewable energy source such as solar. But when this did fail in the 2015, what did pass is just simply requiring a cover on these things. So the cover, I think, is going to be based. The comment in Burlington is, well, let's at least get the cover in there and don't lose that. But the impression I got from the stakeholders there was they weren't entirely comfortable with going this far. And I didn't really hear any great solutions other than, it wasn't like someone said, well, we're more comfortable with 25% of that energy. But I don't know. You guys don't probably deal with a lot of outdoor problems either. I think this is what's tricky about this stuff is just, but again, we're sort of wards of the stakeholders. So where something doesn't fly with support, we'll probably take another stab at this and put something back out there for comment. There is a section in the proposed code that's also from the 2015 IUCC, though, and that's heated pools in conditioned space. So, and that's actually very similar to the language we looked at before. So, for that the snowmelt system. So, they say at least 25% of your energy consumption of your pool and 50% of the peak space HVAC requirements where that pool is located have to be met by on-site renewables or heat recovery. Again, and I don't know if you deal with indoor pools in this group, but not really much. Okay. So there was a bit of there were some public comments. We had a couple of people I think were going to provide some ideas on how to tailor this language. So I think this is going to be revisited and probably not go through as proposed right now. Okay, so yeah, well, we can. Why don't we just take a few-minute break and we'll jump back in with some lighting and some other sections. So whatever time it is right now, take 10 minutes and come back, dig into lighting. We're moving pretty quickly. So how about around 2:20? Come back. Sound good? On the phone, we're going to take a 10-minute break and we'll rejoin. Flip over to the World Cup. We could. Yeah. We had it up during lunch. So. Yeah. The one person.
They walk away.
I know.
Why are we watching the World Cup? No, it was energy quotes when I left.
So Stephanie, tell me again what the group you work with is.
RN Development, Miller Realty Group. We're primarily warehouse and distribution buildings.
Okay.
We do have other buildings.
Mostly in Vermont or the area?
County.
Chittenden County. Okay. Million.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's a lot of going into existing buildings.
Well, we have probably half the new builds, relatively new builds in the code, and then we have a subsection that's about 30-year-old buildings.
Yeah.
We build to a very high standard, well beyond code in the past. So really what our difficulty is being a landlord to retrofit a building, depending on how much you have to change insulation, how much you can reach the point that you're not competitive anymore because we don't get any of the energy savings. Yep. And we have that 50 cents per square foot, $1 per square foot to recoup what you put into it. Yeah. It can be challenging. You're not competitive because it's not worth retrofitting to that degree. To then you can't recoup the lease isn't competitive. Exactly. Right. You can't net it all out. Lighting's not really a concern because lighting's pretty typical for us to go ahead and change. Yeah. You have to anyway. Although interesting, I wanted to tell you with ComCheck though, we had a problem with a building. Here it's high bay 35. We just barely met efficiency, even though we with Efficiency Vermont because he never took into account that it was a high bay building. So it's just something
Yeah,
Wayne Lamberton was so upset.
Like design for best for most applications, unfortunately, for all applications.
But since we have to use this to prove the efficiency of the building, or we could, or we could pay somebody. Yeah, exactly. We could, we can do it ourselves with contract. We'll pay somebody to go through.
We've had a few issues with contracting.
It's something they could just update.
I know.
Take into account high bay.
As I understand it, that will be
Yeah.
I mean, we also discovered that the web there is wrong.
Oh.
There's a big problem with that.
Wrong which way?
It's wrong in every way.
Oh.
If it can take the wrong numbers from different tables, so it's something so it is inaccurate. Why?
Yeah, no, we didn't.
Yeah. So the issue you were talking about. Because, residential side, it's such a high so it's hard to get the corners of the building to the efficiency numbers. It doesn't take.
And it's difficult when you have somebody. I mean, there are a lot of people out there that really do need to bring their buildings up to a basic code. That have not. When you have a company like ours that, for example, we've got a 30-year-old building that we did a gas analysis on. They pay 15 cents a square foot. I mean, if we had to, and I'm not even sure what the R value is.
Yeah.
The building was done so long ago. If we had to bring that up to the current R value, are you really going to get a cheaper price than 15 cents a square foot?
Yeah, that's just a real
See what
world.
I'm saying? So that's really our concern because it's this on top of permitting more difficult, permitting loading up the cart, all the legislative things going through that are not very business-oriented. It's just businesses are being assaulted from all different areas, so it's trying to remain competitive, particularly with our type of space. We're competing with out-of-state. It's hard to compete with New York.
So how do you, I was just, so when you see the code, I mean, again, I don't think this code particularly is a big notch in, envelope requirements, for example. It's not like stuff being struck out.
I was going to say, it's less the new builds. Because new builds you're starting, you can build whatever you want. It's really the retrofit refitting of these old buildings because you will have tenants that will just say, I don't want to pay 50 cents.
Understood, yeah.
Extra.
So the question is, what's the solution? If the code does, so you get the new code in as of next year, right? It goes in just like it is now. It's got this new sections, just more clarified stuff, right? Just to try to make it easier for people to implement. So, you're going to have a bunch of projects that now are going to be, not now are going to be triggered, but you would know they're triggered under alterations. You have to meet all these other sections.
And that's why I need to look at it and see what's required versus, because we have change of use, but we have change of tenants frequently. So if every system, every wall, like I said, lighting's not really a concern because that's pretty standard to have to change out. We don't have a lot of windows. That's not a huge, changing the coverage isn't really an issue for us.
Well, that's a nuanced thing that I didn't really talk about because it hasn't changed. For good or for bad here, but the change of occupancy or use section, say you're not even doing an alteration, you're just they always have this caveat, space is undergoing a change in occupancy that would result in an increase in demand for either fossil fuel or electrical energy, then shall comply with this code. So it's almost like you need to determine if your change in occupancy is truly going from a lower to a higher.
And for warehouse and distribution, we're actually
probably
from an energy use, we're not, obviously going to manufacturing.
Yeah,
There's an incredible increase. But with the warehouse and distribution building, not so much. I mean, that's why, obviously lighting is one of the most important things that we do in our buildings.
That's no
the big
brainer.
energy.
Yeah.
Because the buildings themselves are so efficient. There's no air conditioning.
But your big concern comes if someone, if the code all of a sudden makes you
Change
take your
everything.
metal building, which I imagine you probably deal with a lot like metal buildings and all those things.
No, we don't have any. It could be a possibility. But no, they're pretty popular.
So basically, it's lighting.
Exactly, but our concern would be if it triggers having to change out the insulation. If it just triggers having to change everything by having a space. And I think defining space would be good because a lot of our buildings are multi-user. So is it?
Well, that's the thing. So where does
if it's 10,000 square feet within a 60,000 square foot building?
Well, are they walled off? Or are they?
Yes, yes, they're optimizing walls.
Again, I feel like space is one of these things you know when you see it, right? Definition, but is it?
Yeah, because lighting makes sense.
Yeah.
But if a lot of times we have one rooftop unit that's
Sure.
servicing a number of different spaces. So if it's servicing 40,000 square feet, you're changing out 10,000.
Well, you know that?
Right, so you're talking about a unit that's dedicated to the space.
Is it going to make it happen? Because sometimes these buildings just get cut up in a way we never imagined.
Oh, yeah.
Based on we tend to build a shell and have an idea of how we're subdividing it, but you never know.
For instance, if you go from retail to office, you're fine. If you go from office to retail, and that's easy to relate. But the triggers work definitely depending on that.
And that makes it really tricky in terms of, obviously you want to make sure you're in compliance with it all, but also when you're taking on a tenant, you want to know what the costs associated with it truly are with fit up. And generally, you don't get the tenant until you tell them what the fit up is. But the amount of time that it takes to price out the fit up to work with fire safety, to work with everybody, you can lose the tenant as well. It's not just the code change; it's everything that's happening with development.
And do you all work with like a typical set of engineers?
We do.
You do. You should have folks look at. You might want to write this one down. We didn't really talk about it because, again, it's sort of in the weeds. But 403.2.4.4. No, we laughed too. Zone isolation.
Okay.
Because it just might, I don't know, you all might trigger something like that more often than not. It's hard to even understand right away what it's saying, but it's essentially saying if you have an HVAC system serving over 25,000 square feet floor area, or maybe more than one floor, and they're designed to be occupied non-simultaneously. So maybe something operates at night, it's packaging in one day, or something like that. They have to be divided into isolation areas. So you essentially need to isolate these areas for controlling outdoor air, exhaust air, and conditioned area. So, they're good things to have.
Sounds like tenant retention should remain high on our list of priorities.
Yeah. Due to the new energy code, you're not allowed to leave. Here's a 10-year lease. So Barry, who is on? We still have anybody on the phone? Well, I was out there looking around at the same thing, and I feel like somebody must have added them on this building for another purpose at some random point. Would you really just put it out aesthetic for so you can string lights on? Because it makes this nice setting for like a summer patio function, but certainly didn't need that. You could have built a bridge. I feel like it was there for something.
But it looks like new steel. It doesn't look
Oh, yeah.
Remove the floor.
Maybe it's reclaimed. That's the other thing. It could have been stored here.
Oh, very much.
Yeah. Have you not been reading the banners here, Barry?
No, that's true, yeah.
Like a history of Yankee ingenuity.
There will be welcome center, patio, rustic car, industrial everything.
And they could have literally just been laying there.
Yeah.
And I mean, there is a rail yard. There's all these buildings. Yeah. All right. Well, if you're on the phone, we're going to tune in again. We'll get started here. We'll just keep the thrill and excitement. Just keep rolling. We're on power and lighting section. C405. I think the biggest change for Vermont is something that lighting designers are likely familiar with because it's been in ASHRAE for several cycles now, but is now brought into our code and it's been expanded. And that is the requirement for occupant sensor controls. In 90.1 for a couple cycles now, it's been some of the top bullets. It's been required in classrooms and training rooms. I believe restrooms is in there, but then definitely conference rooms. So they had 2 or 3 sort of bullets. But I will say that ASHRAE used to exclude K-12 classrooms from that, and I believe that was sort of an experiential-based requirement where K-12 classrooms sometimes are just sort of tough places to have lights going on and off, and teachers and kids and all that stuff, and it doesn't always make the most sense. And so that used to be excluded. It's no longer excluded from either the latest version of ASHRAE or the IECC, and they've added all of these space types which are now required to have occupancy sensor controls. I will say, and I think this comes at the next section, I don't have it specifically in here, so if you read the language and you're familiar with lighting, it basically says, right after this, says, if you don't comply with this, then you need to have a time switch control that covers all these spaces. So essentially you need to have a building-wide management system that can turn the lights off at pre-programmed times. Otherwise, you need to have something that is individually controlling these spaces.
I will say to
yeah.
the occupancy controls, we're renovating the office.
At the state?
I hate them. I detest the occupancy controls because the way they're currently set up there is you walk into the office, the light comes on. And I hate them.
So first bullet right here. So because that's really, people, I mean, I think if you ask the average person what they think of an occupancy sensor, it's something that turns the light on when you walk in, which is so counterintuitive to the idea of an occupancy sensor for energy savings.
Yeah, well,
we should let you turn the light on, but it's going to turn you off if you leave.
I've made them switch the light.
Yeah.
So that the vacancy sensor not in the office.
I think it's a fantastic point.
Yeah, they're small individual offices, but still, I mean, you can walk past them.
Sure, or they bounce off the glass, they glare off the reflection.
I'm not even in the office.
Yes. It's a common problem. I don't know why it takes a while for people to catch up. A good lighting design should know that that's not the way to do it. But again, this is, I think the code has now actually gotten at that. So then it says, okay, so it says we're talking about, we just gave you the requirement for occupancy sensor controls, and we're not talking about warehouses, which you in fact deal with a lot. But it says we're not talking about warehouses. And it says it needs to be automatic off within 30 minutes, but it also needs to be manually on. Now, it does allow for it to come on automatically, but it only allows to turn on half the lights, which I still think should just be manual on. I think an occupancy sensor should be manual on. It turns off if there's no activity, and you can always turn it off manually, too. I mean, you shouldn't be forced to keep a light on.
Within 30 minutes,
yeah.
Ever been in a bathroom doing your business and have the lights go on?
Right here, this one does it for you, yeah. And it's very quick. It's like 10 seconds. Yeah, that's a common problem. And they make dual sensing, their sound and motion, so just to get at that issue, which is kind of funny. But yeah, this is doing a better job of that. But again, this does allow you, you can program this for 10 seconds off. It just says within 30 minutes, right? 30 is the max. It's an improvement. Okay, so now we get into warehouses, which Stephanie, as we were just talking about, deals with a lot. I don't think this is anything beyond just good lighting design for a warehouse. I think this is just saying, all right, you have aisleways in a lot of warehouses. You're going to just, light the aisleways, control the aisleways independently, and don't control beyond the aisleways, and reduce the lighting power by at least 50% when it's unoccupied. So,
most of the warehouses the lights actually go out. It's only when you move to each section, then it'll turn on a couple of sections ahead of it. They don't reduce the light, they literally.
Yeah, no,
and that makes sense. I mean, reducing to 50%.
Well, it says at least 50%.
Well,
though,
exactly.
so.
I mean, at least 50%, but it's a good number to be in there. But
Maybe the exceptions might be where there's safety or something else. Or
Exactly.
strange, like lurking, dark aisleway feeling. Depends. Yes, exactly. All right, so then we get into daylighting has come. I would say our 2011 CBs, if I'm correct, has very minimal daylight stuff. It basically gets at some it defines daylight zones, and it says if you fall in one of these daylight zones, you have to have some daylight zone control. But it's very minimal language. I think it's produced a lot of confusion, and that was from national codes as well. And on the national scene, I think the lighting designers in the industry has gone to great lengths to make this more clear and more workable. And therefore, what you get is a heck of a lot more code language, which is hard to read. but it really defines these top light zones where you're lit by skylights, side light zones where you're lit by windows, and then it gets at independent control of the lights between those zones. You have to have daylight responsive controls that are controlled independently. They have to be calibrated within that space. For certain space types listed here, you actually need to be able to dim continuously. In certain situations, you need to have independent controls in different directions and very specific language in the code. So I recommend if you work at all with lighting designers, maybe pass this along. We'll definitely be. I will say at the Burlington meeting, there was no one who was specifically a lighting designer there. There's no one here that's specifically a lighting designer. We know of some of the states that are very active in these code updates in the past, and we're going to force them to comment on this stuff because they're the ones at the end of the day that everyone calls on to see this stuff. Efficiency Vermont staff are also looking at this as well, so it'll get commented on for sure. We did have comments last week about daylight responsive controls that are capable of a complete shutoff. They shall be capable of a complete shutoff. Some people thought that was kind of not appropriate and proposed that be just removed, that's why require it has to shut off all the lights. There's some other than just general, so there's a lighting control section, and then they get into just specific applications that don't really fall under any other category. And it lists some of the stuff here. This is verbatim language from the code. So display cases, display and accent lighting. And the third one I think is the most, I don't know, the one that stands out the most was that you would now have to have hotel and motel sleeping units and guest suites have to have one of these master control devices. So everything can be switched off within 20 minutes after the occupants leave the room. And I think those master control devices are either through the form of where you stick your room key in when you walk in and leave it there until you walk out, or it's some sort of occupant sensing kind of device. But so those have been common overseas for a while, and I've seen them. I don't know. I haven't seen one in Vermont, but I don't usually stay in hotels in Vermont, so I can't say. Then we get to lighting power densities, and do folks in this meeting have vested interest in those? Would you like to see what these are? I mean, or is this something you feel pretty comfortable with? Okay, I mean, it's really, the changes are there. Some things are more stringent. Some things are dialed back a little bit. Like, for example, warehouses actually was at 0.6 watts per square foot, is now proposed to be 0.66 watts per square foot. So who knows? People are just teasing out things, dialing it down, dialing it up. Office is another big one that's common, and it was 0.9 in our current code. It's 0.82 now. So they're really looking into the hundreds of decimal places to get these efficiencies squeaked out. And that's really it for lighting. It's mostly, the power densities and the controls that are big. Then we get into some other miscellaneous electrical power requirements. So there are requirements on motors and transformers, if that applies to you. Most of that, again, follows federal standards. But elevator tabs is something new. Requires at least some efficacy of greater than 35 lumens per watt on your lights, which is not a very stringent requirement, but it's something. It says ventilation fans need to be some sort of lower energy use, watts per square foot, and you have to have some sort of controls to de-energize the elevator with, or the lights and the fans when unoccupied for greater than 15 minutes. So if you're stuck in one, you just have to keep moving. So there's some automatic controls to reduce speed on escalators and moving walks, and there's exceptions in there, but that gets at some energy use that might be wasted in those. And I heard at the last meeting this requirement of regenerative drive is actually pretty standard and pretty easy to implement, I guess. But it's a variable frequency drive that actually takes the the load from the people coming down the escalator and uses that to supply energy back to the building. So don't generating your own electricity off the escalator, which I've never seen before myself. This is that's it for specific sections. Now, this is new to our code and is part of the. You follow the code prescriptively. You now need to choose one of these additional efficiency packages. So the option part is just that you have 6. Choosing one is mandatory. And one of them is 90% of the lighting power density. So you literally just, every space type you have applicable in your building, you would use 90% of the lighting power density. And that would, check that off the list and you're done. And I think what we're seeing with these lighting power densities is as people move towards LEDs, they're extremely easy to hit. It's just not that hard anymore. Okay, and then another option would be efficient HVAC. You greater than 10% improvement on the efficiency level above the minimum stated standard. And then you've got, I'm looking for myself for these next ones. There's enhanced digital lighting controls. Again, I would have to look myself into what exactly that says, but it's just an enhanced control configuration for your lighting. And then you've got on-site renewables, which I would like to pull out. Yeah, provide not less than a half a watt per square foot of conditioned floor area, or not less than, or not less than 3% of the energy used within the building for mechanical and service water heating and lighting. Provide that by on-site renewable energy systems. That's right. Yeah, and enhanced digital lighting controls is just continuous dimming, addressing things individually, digital control system, controlling fixtures. So there's a lot of little sort of point criteria. So that's the renewable energy one. And then you have dedicated outdoor air system, just equipped with an independent ventilation system, providing not less, at least the 100% outdoor air to each individual occupied space, capable of energy recovery, et cetera. So there's some requirements in there. That's an option. And then there's reduced energy use in service water heating. And this does get at some specific residential type occupancies and other ones. And what exactly? Oh, yeah. And it basically, what this one says is provide at least 60% of your hot water requirements with waste heat recovery or solar water heating. That's what that one is. And there is a consideration to add some solar roof-ready language, and we will post that with the next draft of this. Hopefully this week, this week we should be able to get that up, and that would just have a requirement that if you're not meeting your on-site, if you don't choose the on-site renewables one, then you'll at least get your plan for your roof to be roof-ready, and that's actually not. It's been determined that we don't. Well, it's been determined that the interest isn't in making it super onerous in terms of wiring and conduit and all this stuff. It's more just planning for enough roof space so that your roof isn't occupied with, like, all the HVAC stuff isn't somewhere where you can't get one contiguous space to provide renewables on there. So we got to pull up that language and get that out for public comment explicitly. The first, yeah, the proposal is that if you wouldn't do the on-site, if you don't choose on-site renewables, then you would do that. Then you have to at least do the roof ready.
Problematic in ours when we don't know whether they change. We've been approached by solar farms who want to use our roofs, but the minute you have to put on a new rooftop or change something, it becomes difficult. We do have single tenants that have long-term leases.
You can do that, yeah.
So then it sounds like
okay. Yeah, how does it apply to existing buildings? One thing, if it's a new construction, it makes a little more sense because really the language is just asking people to consider.
But that's what I was going to say. Even new construction, because for example, we're building a 180,000 square foot building that's one tenant. You could take it 100, and then you could do that, or it could be 30 foot suite with individually set.
Units,
so it's a little more problematic.
Okay, yeah. So I mean, I think we need to get that out for consideration and what that actually, how that applies.
One thing I'll note, stretch code is something that's coming along later. As I mentioned, some of this came from stuff that organization NBI did, which got turned into the Massachusetts stretch code, which ended up in this code. One thing that Massachusetts is looking at in the next version of the stretch code is requiring more than one of these. So that's one option. Because you're unfamiliar with a lot of them. A because they're new, so B because most people just go for option number one.
Yeah.
Like almost all of the time. So, and it's very easy to do. So they're looking at just requiring that, and then again, this is for the stretch code, just requiring option one, and then another one from the remaining 5.
Yeah, and I think that's our stretch code suggestion right now is choose 2.
Okay. So, consistency, you can say for sure.
So system commissioning, though, I would refer yourself to the actual section here, but this is new. This would be new for Vermont. So what the National Model Code has done is taken language that's been used in Washington State for many years, several cycles, and just requires building commissioning. We considered this last update during the 2011 CBs. Stakeholders essentially came to the conclusion that they weren't ready for a whole section that required commissioning report, functional performance testing, et cetera, for all buildings. And so in Vermont's code, there's a criteria for 50,000 square feet or more, and then it gets at just very specific functional testing on economizers, hydronic systems, and VAV fan control, which essentially are other systems that are required by code. So it's like, let's just commission those, make sure they're being tested, and we'll call that good. And it's only for big buildings where it really shouldn't be 2 owners anyway, because they're likely doing commissioning anyway. So now we get to, if we accept what's been proposed or what's in the IECC, it really requires commissioning across 3 main end uses: water, heating, mechanical, and lighting controls. It requires functional performance testing of each of these, and then it requires some commissioning reports, essentially documentation. We discussed this at the Burlington meeting with a large group there, and people's feeling was we should still consider maybe a threshold of square footage. Again, nothing clear came out of it, but there was some talk of that. There's definitely some push that we should include our Vermont-specific language from last time, which detailed who was allowed to approve to do this. So it was approved commissioning agents. They were independent of the design team, so they weren't on the design team. They were like sort of more contracted to the owner. They essentially had no financial interest in the sort of the outcome of the building, and then that they had some sort of level of experience. But I don't know if any of you deal with building commissioning on a regular basis, but I think it's this is definitely up for debate, and it's not a settled issue whether this will stay as is. So something to consider. And we can talk about stretch code, which my goal, and Barry's pushing me to get this out. That way we need to get this in front of people. And what we're envisioning here is we'll have the CB's code, and then we'll have an addendum essentially that says if you're doing the stretch code, you now must comply with points A, B, C, and D, and E. And then we ideally would denote within the code itself where if you had to go with the stretch code, you would note inside the code itself that this section is addressed by stretch. So there's something that's different for stretch. I think that's the ideal scenario. But right now, the main issues that we're trying to put out this week would be Well, we talked about before. So this would be a reference for Act 250. That's sort of the driver. But what would be in here is under the envelope section. So I mentioned right now, you could comply with the whole air leakage section or air barrier section with a blower door test, an air leakage test, but that's just an option. You don't have to do it. So most people just comply by proving that they're using approved materials or approved, they're using approved assemblies. So now what they would add is that you are either required to do you use these materials and you actually do the blower door test, or you use the materials and you don't do a test, but you have continuous air barrier commissioning. So that would specify what that is. It would define the continuous air barrier commissioning. That, I believe that language is actually coming out of the Massachusetts Stretch Code for air barrier commissioning.
I don't recall off the top of my head. I think it's probably that same, what they tried to put in the 20.
Yeah.
So likely it's exactly the
same. And then inside this document, we have installation values. I can see. So stretch code requirement would just basically push some installation values. And honestly, some of these right now have already been proposed to be in the base. So, we've already had public comment saying make the base higher for roof metal buildings and insulation above deck. But this would be a proposal to go to, for example, an R60 in your attic, and your wood frame walls to just to increase that almost 25-30% increase in insulation value there. And really, there's no other proposed change for the stretch code in the other values. Some change to the U factors of fixed windows. That's really it. There's not a lot on the table for insulation, envelope insulation values left to pick from, really. So then energy recovery would essentially just further expand. So if you're doing stretch code, it would just limit it, or it would expand into systems that had over 1,000 CFM of outdoor air, and then you'd be doing energy recovery. So it'd be a more stringent requirement. Duct leakage, which we didn't even talk about because it hasn't changed in our code, but this would get at some lower the maximum leakage allowed in high pressure systems. And again, this second bullet is dependent on how the base code turns out. If we end up limiting or expanding the insulation requirement on exterior ducts somehow or limiting those somehow, then this might go away. But right now, if the insulation values on ducts stayed as is, you could limit the percent of ductwork outside the thermal envelope to a certain percentage of it. So that's a proposal. And then the pipe insulation table would essentially just be increased requirements, so essentially turn that up a notch. And it is a stretch code, so we require more insulation on surface water heating pipes. There are some computer server room requirements, which would really come from, if you're familiar at all with the core performance tiers that operate in Vermont. It would essentially take, there's Tier 1 and Tier 2, and it would take some of the Tier 2 requirements that are specific to computer server rooms for over 5 tons, and it would have different economizer HVAC controls, humidification, and fan power limitation requirements for those applications. And then electric vehicle charging stations. Now, Barry, this one we'll need to work out, but it's been debated in the residential code a lot, but it's being proposed in residential stretch code right now. Is that correct? And it's essentially what, one spot in every?
Basically one spot.
Okay. And we'd be consistent. So
we'd be consistent, and it's not like I would.
Who pays for it? That's always been our issue.
Yeah, because you guys
the whole neighborhood comes.
Well, you guys. Well, then you guys triple net everything out.
we do. I mean, we have gross income, but even our tenants aren't going to be particularly happy about someone coming into a park at midnight and charging their car. Well, you know,
that's right. Who pays the bill?
Who pays the bill?
I would envision that it would be something along those lines.
That is interesting.
That depends on how you use it, or who the tenants are, etc. So I mean, those going to be different responses.
It's difficult if you have to put in that infrastructure. You have to pay for the infrastructure, and then the other tenant who doesn't want it.
But I think that, the idea here, I mean, you're all aware, is that in 10 or 15 years, we could all be kicking ourselves in the butt for building a new building that didn't have that infrastructure, right, in case we are a lot more electric vehicles.
Yeah.
I mean,
Vermont, I lived in London. Their electric vehicles made a lot of sense. Vermont,
yeah.
Vermont, the average commute is well within the range of our life. We think it makes sense to put in the level 1 infrastructure to see what the response are, etc. Moving forward, we'll probably get a little bit more detailed into what we are commercial, what kind of required have, etc. But that's further down the line. And depending on demand, depending on what stakeholder comments are, warehouses,
well, or also, do they want to pay for their employees to use their electric?
No, I mean, that's it.
That's
or,
what's tricky about all of it.
It also depends on the system that gets put in as well. You can get ones that are operated by a third party that install. There's a lot of different things that are happening in that market. So
that is interesting because I go to work now and they don't pay for my gas, right?
Right,
So
no, that's exactly.
And I'm just I haven't heard this point of it discussed. Even at the residential this morning, the discussion was more around whether it'd be more valuable to actually just run the conduits. Maybe level 1, people seem to be fine with the level 1, but they said maybe we should run big enough conduits for the level 2 when that comes along.
I mean, I think it's difficult because it's just another cost of something that may or may not be at the technology that it should be at versus running a conduit. Absolutely, that's easy. You do that all day long.
Our thought was, it's like you're doing the level 1. We haven't explicitly stated that. So our thought was maybe part of the line will include it's going to be expandable by X so that you can run more through a level 2 or a level 3 in the future without having to go in and dig up. We thought that the level 1 was a reasonable start. It's just essentially a socket, especially on the commercial side. We're focusing probably more on like office areas where people will be or feasible for them to have. As I say, we're trying to put it into the code so that gets people thinking about it, so that next time if we put it in, it's likely to perhaps be base code and see your sign, something similar to this, or we might be more detailed as to what kind of services we're looking for. I mean, we are definitely moving towards a more electrified transportation. Whether or not we're going to be time or everybody really has to do it. It's a different matter. It depends on the uptake of the business. We do have quite a number of them. But then again, we're relatively small. Actually, some of them do not bad.
Yeah, I'm an outlier because I live in the Mad River Valley.
Well, I mean,
I would never even contemplate.
I'm somewhat similar. I live in Starkville and I feel there, but I go to Richmond, so bus, which is what I do.
You just had a charging station there.
Well, that's the thing.
There are going to be fist fights breaking out all over Vermont over the charging station and all these locations.
Well, I mean, that's why we're kind of looking at the possibility of making it like a scalable thing. So we're not wanting to do it today, but we're not wanting to have too few. So we want it to be able to be scaled in the future, but not necessarily have all there, but the basic infrastructure is cables.
Right now, you can just put a picnic bench and have cell phone, laptop charging or something. So
Yeah.
people take break, make be like employee satisfaction stuff. Yeah. So the smoke break is the charge break.
I mean, like for a lot of commercial, like there's a few supermarkets around Burlington that will get some solar panels. Solar power charging station? It's not. No, solar panels generate like nearly 10%. That's a level 2 anyway, which would mean you have to be charged for hours in order to get a good charge. There's a level 3, which is the fast charge. But again, it's all tiered. Level 3 is more expensive. 2, it's just 3. So, as I said, it's all scaled. Our thought is that want to say, have the infrastructure, the basic infrastructure in place for the future if you decide to do this. And the next kind of iterations will probably get much more detailed. Warehouses, you might go, maybe you only need like a couple. Employees, you have in a warehouse. For retail purposes, also like Walmart or Kohl's or something along those lines. Chargers outside. But where exactly that falls, we're not sure. There's a lot of movement happening right now. But nothing's really solidified. So I would say this is just our way to try and get it in.
Okay. Well, I would encourage you to comment on that.
Yeah, I was going to say, in thinking about it, if I was a retailer, I would definitely want a charging station establishment because they're in there shopping for longer. There's multiple ones. If you just think of it, that perhaps it can't be one size fits all in terms of, because not every warehouse in Green Mountain Coffee Roasters has tons of employees, but warehouses in general have fewer employees than an office function. And then there's also, it'll be interesting to see from an HR perspective how people control it when you only have so many charges.
Sure. Well, the cost thing too.
And
What pays for your employee to charge.
the cost, and then obviously if you think of it as kind of a smart meter, the way smart parking meters, that's a more expensive. It's just, I think with all these things, to think from a cost perspective is important to not make it so onerous that people stop building. Because we're starting to get to that point, the tipping point of commercial. It's in County becoming incredibly difficult.
Well, it's like we thought that perhaps wouldn't be too expensive to include, depending on
when you've got 40 buildings, how many per building?
Again, it might be that this is you still have to really kind of figure out building requirement or building requirement.
Exactly.
I doubt that if we're going to require, maybe if you were doing your car park or something, that doesn't really trigger the energy code. So there's no real way to get to that. If you're building a new building, certainly existing buildings, I think it's a lot more curious.
Well, we should note that's got to be part of the explicit language, whether or not this is, because it would be a big gray area to go refer to Chapter 5 and try to figure out whether something like that.
I mean, I'm not envisioning it being for existing buildings. That would be really expensive.
Yeah, and in general, I would say people are responsive. I mean, we had put in a charging station for some trucks. They weren't electric, but they had a charging function. As a landlord, you do that, but it's one thing to put it in because somebody has a need as opposed to anticipating possibly a need.
Which is why it sounds like you were more conducive to the conduits because then you can respond to the need when it's the time. So I think we'll take that comment in, and if you have other comments to provide on that, definitely open to those suggestions. So, get that input.
Part of the conduits, and if you want, you can put in the charging station, but future. Something along those lines.
tied in probably to the permitted number of parking spaces.
Yeah.
You know, so many per.
Yeah, so I mean, it's like right now we're looking at level 1 5. It may be the fact that there's scalable persons who may have to provide food for everything in the future, or provide conduit in order to supply like a level 2 charger for 2 parking spaces.
And for a new building, providing the conduit would not be onerous at all if you already know where your parking spaces are. That's not that difficult.
It's just knowing where the conduit was.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Well,
Well, I mean, it's like those language, you know, I don't know if that, you know, the charging station, you know, 5 feet of the midline of the car park. I don't know that we actually include that. I think that was one of the many proposals we see. I mean, as I say, in the future we're probably going to do good. It makes more sense for, you know, certain retail places to have more warehouses, certainly relatively few workers. They don't need quite as many. On average, how many car parking spaces do you have, you know?
well, we've got a 42,000 square foot building with, you know, so it's got a small office function.
Yeah. I mean, that was, you know, the way it's currently written, you know, if you look at one other that we apply for that. I don't know how.
Yeah, right.
To me, not being in the business, cost this out, it doesn't seem so bad. It could very well be worse. When you deal with one building, it's fine. If you deal with 40, you know, the cost adds up. But as I said, I don't.
That would be important. So I would say with a new building, I would agree it's not.
I think the comment's taken that it just should be explicit in that section.
Yeah.
I think it's just
That
for
would be
new
honoring.
construction only. You know, something. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Because, I mean, if you start to miss the opportunity if we're rebuilding it not to do this, but I mean, how to write that in code language to say,
Okay.
So maybe the car park does trigger it, as opposed to just even refitting up your building doesn't.
I mean, maybe it could be tied perhaps to
Yeah.
a lot of the lighting. Your socket, your standard socket, a lot of them they're walkable. So maybe that's a way around it.
Okay. Well, the last thing is what we already mentioned was if you got the additional efficiency packages, you would have to do 2. So you can see stretch code isn't similar to the res. It's not, you know, it's not like a whole rewritten code. It's really just a few critical things that would notch, you know, the building requirements up and increase stringency and try to make an overall efficient package. And for designers and builders who are doing things well above code anyways, it might not be much of a stretch, unintended. So that, I mean, that's it. That's all we have here. Now this is earlier than, you know, the allotted amount of time. So I'm here for any comments, questions at all. Otherwise, this is how to reach us, and that website is just, you can find your public service department. You can comment online there, which is great. If anything pops in your mind, just drop a comment. It takes really almost no time to fill that out. And we look forward to just taking in these comments, responding back to folks. Again, July 9th is the big push to get most of this comment in. So if you need additional time or I'm more than happy to meet with people as they need to. If you have colleagues or designers or others who just want to have a phone call or meet and talk about this stuff in person, I mean, I can make that happen. So just let us know. Otherwise, just get us the information we need, and you have to communicate, and we'll keep going from there. Otherwise, thanks for your time, though. I mean, it's really appreciated. Yeah. Hey, well, I think last time we must have 25, 30 people last week, so you get a lot more tangents for sure. Who won the World Cup game, Stu? That's your job. Yeah. Well, good. We're just checking.
I have one question.
Yeah, please.
Only slightly off subject.
Oh, hold on one second. So thank you to whoever's on the phone. If you don't have any questions, I guess Carrie will check the computer. I'll wait a second. Otherwise, we're gonna hang up on this. So I'll hold on a second. Okay. Thank you very much for listening in and your time.